All right, welcome to the second installment, live from Monk Kitchen. We're talking about sandwich deformation here. And right now, Livy is cutting our sandwich in half. In the last video, we demonstrated something called ductile deformation, where rocks fold as a result of stress applied along plate boundaries. In this video, we're going to talk about brittle deformation, and this is where rocks will actually break due to stress along different plate boundaries. So I'm going to go ahead and show you what that looks like. Remember, we talked about in the last video 3 different plate boundaries: convergent, divergent, and transform. Yep. And so the first example would be where we have compression. And so along a convergent plate boundary, you have rock that is being pushed together. And as a result, there's a lot of stress that builds. And sometimes that stress exceeds the strength of the rock, and the rock breaks. And it breaks along what we call a fault. So in this example, what's going to happen as I force my hands together is we're going to have one block of rock pushed up relative to the other along the fault. So the fault would be where the two halves meet. And you can see that there's displacement of the layers on either side. In a second example, we're going to put the halves back together. This would be an example of a divergent plate boundary where I'm going to apply a tensional stress, tensile. And you're going to see that as I pull these rock blocks apart, one block of rock drops relative to the other. This is also an example of a fault. The first fault that we saw along a convergent plate boundary is called a reverse fault. This would be an example of something we call a normal fault, where one block of rock drops down relative to the other block of rock along a fault. And this is typical in places like Iceland or along the mid-ocean ridge system, where we have those tensional stresses along divergent plate boundaries. The third example, I'm going to put my two halves back together, is something that we call shear stress, which occurs along transform plate boundaries like the San Andreas Fault. And here, imagine if you were flying above, like you had an aerial view, and what you're going to see is, looking down, the blocks of rock are actually moving laterally in opposite directions along the fault. So here you're not going to get a vertical cross section, you're going to get a horizontal displacement along the transform plate boundary. And so we'll talk more about the San Andreas Fault when we get into our unit on earthquakes. I'm going to go ahead and show you guys an image, and then we'll load it into Notability that demonstrates these 3 types of stressors and then the resulting deformation. So we have compression for convergent plate boundaries, tension, divergent plate boundaries, and then shear stress along transform plate boundaries. Again, in the first video, we talked about ductile deformation, so we can get folding or thinning or contortion of the rock layers from the surface. And then the second video that we just filmed shows brittle deformation in the form of faulting. So we have a reverse fault towards the top there, a normal fault in the middle, and then a transform fault, which would be like an aerial perspective or a horizontal perspective. So that's all for now. Consider these your notes. Livy's going to sign off by eating some of the sandwich. Geology is delicious. All right, peace out.
Oh, that tastes disgusting.
That tastes disgusting. Look at that earthquake or sinkhole.